it's interesting about the puffballs because like a lot of other mushrooms, they often go unnoticed, and a lot of the tales tonight will be about fungi that go unnoticed. Did anyone see any mushrooms or other fungi on your way in today? It's pretty hot and dry out, and so some people are saying yes, some people, most people apparently didn't. They're out there even though you may not have seen them, and they're in your homes, they're on your bodies. So I mean, most people are oblivious to a lot of the wildlife that's around and flora and fauna that's around, and assume that you know, humans live kind of in a fairly sterile environment with not a lot of diversity. But there really is a lot, even in an urban setting. There's a lot of organisms around, including in our homes, that most people don't know about, and that's much of what the stories will be about tonight. The puffballs are definitely a group that's underappreciated by most people, myself included, because I'm not that crazy about them. But they really are pretty amazing. They can inhabit a lot of parts of the world that's too harsh for a lot of other fungi. Case in point, just a couple weeks ago, I was in Nepal doing a first ever fungal expedition to document mushrooms in the most famous park in Nepal, in the Sagarmatha National Park. It's a World Heritage Site, and lots of people go there to see Mount Everest every year. So it's a very famous park and world renowned. And we were documenting for the first time mushrooms there, a lot of very rare things, without a doubt, things that don't even have a name, which is hard to believe because so many people traipse right through there every year. The puffballs were some of the most numerous things we saw, and especially once we got above tree line, where there were still plants and therefore some plant matter to decompose, we were seeing puffballs. And so puffballs, in fact, were the species of fungi we saw at highest elevation, somewhere at 17,000 feet. This is way above the highest peak in the Rocky Mountains, way above it. It's very hard for humans to, or at least for me, this human, to hang out there, but there they were and going about their business, just like, you know, wasn't a big deal. So it's interesting to mention about the puffballs. Should I stand here? Is that best, or right over there? Okay, well, we'll see. If it doesn't work out, just someone tell me to move, or maybe there'll be comments from people on Zoom saying, what happened to the presenter? Did he leave, or whatever? So anyways, the tales tonight will be, did we need to do something to make these work? Just advance. Slides aren't advancing. Did I put the batteries in upside down? The button's lighting, but the slides aren't advancing. Help. The slides aren't advancing. I'm sure we forgot to do something else. And I don't know anything about Zoom, so. So anyways, the fungi in tonight's presentation is, are there a lot of people who are basically beginners and don't know that much about fungi? Okay, most of the hands, good. So there'll be nothing technical really at all in tonight's presentation. A lot of basic things, basic factoids, and then we'll showcase a number of oddball things that are common around here in Ohio, as well as some other places. So anyways, yeah, so these will be definitely not, this is not a presentation, you know, that you need a lot of scientific know-how. This is basic stuff about fungi and interesting things, including a lot of stuff that really are hidden in plain sight all around us right here in the Midwest. And it'll be tales from the fifth kingdom. The fifth kingdom is what mycologists oftentimes refer to as the kingdom of fungi, because it was the fifth named kingdom. People that are slightly older than me probably learned in school as kids that fungi were still part of the plant kingdom, because that's what people thought, but they're actually quite different. In fact, they're much more similar to you and I, as we'll see with the next slide here after this. This is just a shameless ad for the book that much of this presentation will be on. And I actually do not have any other copies with me except for this one. And the reason is twofold. One, I have run out of them, and I've been having trouble getting bulk amounts from the publisher, because I guess it's been selling really well or something. I don't know, hopefully. But anyways, the other thing is actually you can get it from the publisher cheaper than you could get it from me. If you see the discount code here, if you enter that at the Princeton University store page, you can get 30% off. And I think maybe it's free shipping too. Did anyone buy any? Did you have to pay for shipping?
We have 5 copies here too.
Oh, okay. Are you willing to part with them?
Yes.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
they'll sell you copies if you have to be if you have too much money. I did bring some other books because some people just insist on buying books. So I brought a couple other books. I have this Beginner's Guide to Mushrooms, which came out 1 year ago, that I co-wrote with another author. It works for the Midwest as well as the East and the West Coast, and it's only $20, and it's definitely for beginners. And then I have our beautiful Ammonites of North America book. It has a lot of basic stuff as well and pretty pictures. It also has technical things too, if you're more technically minded. And I already saw one in the audience today, so it has been field tested by people in the room. Okay, so enough of shameless ads. Fungi Basics. So if you don't know anything about fungi, get ready because you're about to get an earful. So what are fungi? They are eukaryotes. They are extremely diverse, and basically what we now are learning is that we know almost none of them in the environment. We're just starting to learn about what they are and what they're doing. So they're eukaryotes. So this means that in all of the groups of life, there's 5 kingdoms of life. The most simplest are the single-celled bacteria and archaea. Those are prokaryotes. They're single-celled organisms that have a cell membrane, often a cell wall, but no membrane-bound organelles in their cells, and they're quite tiny, or at least most of them. There's been a recent discovery of bacteria that are extremely large. In fact, they're centimeters long and can be seen with the naked eye. But other than those, for the most part, bacteria are much smaller than a human cell. And they're prokaryotes, no membrane-bound organelles, no mitochondria, no nucleus, nothing like that. The cell itself functions as a nucleus and as a mitochondrion. All the other kingdoms of life are eukaryotes like us. So those are, of course, membrane-bound cells, sometimes with cell walls like plants and fungi, sometimes with no cell walls like animal cells. And then protozoans are also in there as well. So they have membrane-bound organelles like a nucleus and mitochondria and ribosomes and things like that. So that's the main difference there. Animals and fungi come from a common ancestor, so we are most closely related to them and most similar. So the processes in our cells and our physiology is much more similar to fungi than bacteria or plants, etc. This is why if you get a bacterial infection, you can eat buckets of antibiotic that will kill bacteria, won't harm your cells because it doesn't have a lot of the same physiology. You get a toe fungus, on the other hand, and you can't kill it very easily because their cells are very similar to our own cells, and it's tough to poison those cells without poisoning our own. So, why haven't they figured out a lot of toenail and athlete's foot, lotions and things? Well, this is why. Their cells are very, very similar to ours. We'll see melanin and other things that are very commonly going on in our bodies. Fungi do these same things too, sometimes for different purposes. So fungi are extremely diverse. They are, as we know, sensitive in a lot of situations to being in moist environments, but they can also be in very dry climates as well. So fungi live lots of places where other organisms cannot, believe it or not. Even the hottest, driest regions on the planet have all kinds of fungi, including mushroom-forming fungi like truffles. They're very common in deserts, believe it or not. They're hidden, but they are there. If you went to Antarctica, this is what you would see for miles and miles and miles. Almost no organisms in much of Antarctica. It's simply too dry and too cold, and it also gets blasted with tremendous amounts of radiation. You wouldn't think this would be a place where fungi are, but they're the dominant organisms there, believe it or not. Not like mushroom fungi, but other kinds of fungi. So you'll see a few kinds of plants that can make a go of it, a few kinds of insects, not a lot of animals, not birds, lizards, certainly no fish, but there's fungi all over the place. All of these rocks you see, that's where the fungi are. The radiation's too intense. The wind is too drying, the air is too cold for a lot of the fungi to live on the top of the soil, on tops of the rocks. So a lot of the fungi exist as lichens, sort of a symbiotic association between a photobiont, like an algae or a cyanobacterium, and a fungus. We have lichens around here. They don't necessarily live endolithically or inside of rocks like they do in Antarctica. But break open any of these rocks and you'll see these bands of color, believe it or not. These black and green bands inside the rock. So the surface of the rock's here, they're inside the rock, protected from the ionizing radiation, the UV radiation, protected from the drying and the cold and everything else. And this was just discovered not all that long ago, just a couple decades ago, these dark fungi that are fans in rocks. They've been there the whole time. They're the dominant organisms. No one knew about it until recently. Isn't that amazing? And so anyways, that's sort of the point of this book. The two main things that come out in the book, if you decide to pick up a copy somewhere or buy it or order it or whatever, is that much of what we thought about fungi ain't necessarily no. There's a lot of brand new discoveries, and a lot of the new discoveries in the book are like, how could someone have not seen this before? You know, this is so obvious, and yet nobody really looked. And then the other factoid is that much of the reason that people didn't know about is because a lot of it's hidden basically in plain sight around us. There's oftentimes small organisms in the soil, inside of other organisms. Even though they're super common, they're existing in ways that are very different from a lot of the other organisms that we've been more familiar with for the rest of our lives. Okay, so let's discuss some chemistry and physiology factoids. So if you learned anything about fungi in school, because basically fungi get covered like for a minute in biology class, and then people quickly move on to teaching about plants or other things. So if fungi get mentioned at all, it's usually to point out that, well, there are fungi, we know that they rot things, and isn't that great, because we would soon get buried under organic matter on the planet. And okay, that's all you need to know about fungi. Oh, and there's like yeasts that are used in brewing, I guess. So that's all you need to know. So, and this is Cincinnati, so that's important. So, you know, other parts of the country where they don't have so much brewing, you probably didn't even get that second factor. So, and as it turns out, we really probably wouldn't be buried under organic plant matter and other debris were it not for fungi functioning as saprobes. We know this because as you dig down through the soil, you'll run into big pockets of fossils that have piled up, and instead of oxidizing, they've reduced and become fossil fuels. And when we look at these pockets of fossil fuels, it's when plants covered the planet, the debris was building up and getting buried, and there was no fungi around to rot the material. We know this because in amongst the fossil fuels, and even actual pieces of leaves and imprints of leaves and parts of plants that are sometimes still in the fossil fuels, there's no spores of fungi. We see spores start massing in soil layers just above the epochs on the planet where the fossil fuels were made. And so that's when fungi came onto the planet. The pollen of plants and spores of fungi last a really long time when they're buried, basically forever. So we know a lot about things from tens of thousands and even millions of years ago by finding pollen in the soil. Fossilized creatures, let's see the Iceman. We know exactly what season of the year it was by finding pollen and spores in this guy's lungs and stomach, because these things don't break down. So it really is, well, it really is true that we probably would be buried under organic matter on the planet were it not for fungi. Turns out that, unlike what we learned at school, the vast majority of fungi are not saprobes and do not rot things. The vast majority of fungi do something else, but for sure some do. And when they do rot stuff, this is what happens. You've seen this in the woods before when you've seen fallen logs that were well rotted in the woods. Often they're either this kind of brown and blocky, I see nodding heads, or the wood's kind of like white and stringy. And so I'm sure you probably thought, I don't know what this tree was before it rotted, but the reason it looks like this now is because that's characteristic of the wood. If you thought that, you were wrong. The reason that it looks like this is not because of the wood nor the tree necessarily. It has much more to do with the fungus involved. If you approach wood that's like this brown and blocky, it's often conifer wood, but not always. But anyways, if you find wood that looks like this, it's because of brown rot fungi. These fungi rot the cellulose in the wood and leave the lignin behind. So here's the other the second sort of technical point. I mentioned the prokaryote, eukaryote thing that was kind of technical. This is the second sort of technical thing, but it won't be a big deal, I promise you. So the reason wood piles up and not a lot of stuff breaks it down, and there's not a lot of animals that can actually even eat wood and digest it, is because the cell walls of plants are made of cellulose. That's these big molecules of carbohydrates, really tough to break these bonds, take special kinds of enzymes. A lot of fungi make these enzymes and really nothing else. Some bacteria do, but not very well. The cell walls are made of cellulose. What holds them together, the sort of cement around them, that's the lignin part. So because both of these things are so difficult to break down, even fungi really are not good at breaking down both of them. So the fungi that do rot would basically break down either lignin or cellulose. So in the case of the brown rot fungi, these guys break down the cellulose and use that as an energy source and leave the lignin behind. And in fact, that's for the most part why soil is brown everywhere in the world. It's a lot of lignin from rotting plant matter, believe it or not. And so it says here's some other factoids about brown rot fungi. If you know your mushrooms, you know what these scientific names here, Fomitopsis and Phaeolus and Letoporus. These are different types of polypore fungi that people like. Phaeolus schweinetzii is the dyer's polypore, and Letoporus is the chicken of the woods mushroom. Phalinus here is colored because I'm going to show you a picture of Phalinus in just a second. And conversely, if the wood that you found in the woods rotting looked like white and stringy, that's from white rot fungi. Those fungi typically break down the cellulose somewhat, although scientists think maybe they break down just enough to get it out of the way because they're actually at the lignin and they get rid of the lignin, and that's why there's no more brown in this wood and it gets stringy and falls apart. And the fungi that do this are things like honey mushrooms, like Armillaria, Pleurotus, which are oyster mushrooms, Ganodermas, Termites, Xylaria, Pizziza, and Chloroceboria is colored because I'm going to show you that in a second as well. So this is typically what happens. For more about it, I mean, the book goes into a little more details, but this is probably sufficient to know as to what's going on with wood rot fungi. So what is happening? Well, this picture is a picture of an aspen tree, and there's lots and lots of aspen trees like this in the mountains. They have kind of smooth white bark, kind of like a birch tree, but not papery like a birch tree. But they also have these kind of crusty scabs where branches and things were. But if you happen to be looking really, really closely, you'll see some of these scars and wounds on the tree actually aren't scars. They're a polypore fungus coming out the side. This is the mushroom of a fungus that lives in the tree. And the top part looks kind of brown and scaly like the wounds on the tree. The bottom part's nice and smooth, and there's tiny, tiny holes. That's where the spores are going to come out. And this is a Phalinus tremuli growing on an aspen, which is Populus tremuloides. So that's how this fungus gets the name. So what the heck's it doing on the tree? Well, I showed you previously. It's a brown rot fungus. So it's rotting the cellulose and leaving the lignin behind. And sure enough, if you were to somehow get on the inside side of this mushroom and see what's going on, which this picture shows here, you would see this fungus got in through maybe a wound in the tree and has been rotting this dead woody material, leaving the brown lignin behind. And it's even moving into this other part of the tree here. And that's what it does, what it makes its living doing. It doesn't really harm the tree, believe it or not, because in fact, a lot of fungi, maybe most fungi, maybe almost all fungi that are growing on trees don't really harm the tree. It looks like it might be, but they mostly grow in the dead heartwood of the tree. So this is another factoid about trees you may not have known. When you see a tree growing in your lawn or wherever, the vast majority of what you see is that tree is actually dead material. Only the outer skin, well, actually underneath, the outer skin is a corky bark that protects the tree, but underneath that corky bark, that outer skin is the phloem and the vascular tissue of the tree. Just underneath that is all dead cells from previous year's growth. So the vast majority of the tree is actually dead, just the skin and the twigs and the leaves. All that inner material, fungi can tap into and rot, and usually it doesn't even harm the tree. The fungus stays in one place, the tree doesn't seem to mind. But there's other things that are competing for this resource because that's a lot of carbohydrates there if you can rot it. So other things can get into the wound too and start rotting. Well, this fungus knows this will happen. So as its mycelia grow through this heartwood, it will lay down this layer of sort of like a wall, this darkened material here. It's melanizing the cells to wall off. Imagine this in 3 dimensions, not just 2 dimensions. It's walling off this whole zone and claiming it for itself. And it's going to now slowly rot this dead tree material over time. And just like the melanin in our skin, fungi make melanin to protect from other perturbations from the environment, chemicals, plant toxins, other microbe toxins, etc. And it's basically the same compound being used for sort of a different purpose. So have you seen this before, these black lines? If you've ever seen spalted wood, like you've maybe heard of bird's eye maple or curly maple that people fashion into guitars or bowls or pipes or cabinets. There's no such thing as a curly maple or a bird's eye maple. It's just maple, or maybe it's not even maple. It's wood that's been infected with a fungus, a wood rot fungus that creates this melanized zone. And when people turn this into wooden objects, it looks really pretty. And each one is unique because, of course, the fungus is growing kind of semi-randomly. But you can see what's going on here. This is intact wood. The fungus is actually on this side of this melanized wall, this zone, and it's bleaching the wood. And of course, eventually it would, had it not been turned into a pipe, it would have rotted and the wood would fall apart. Same with this bowl over here. That's was a block of wood that was purposely inoculated with a number of wood rot fungi by a scientist at University of Oregon, or Oregon State University, Sarah Robinson. She's one of the world's experts in wood rot fungi, and she inoculates wood with all kinds of different fungi that create different pigments, like the blue-green you see here from Chlorosiboria, as well as some pink and other colors. And this isn't something new. People have known about this for centuries. If you know what Tunbridge ware wood is from Tunbridge Wells in England in the late 1800s, it became very fashionable for certain master woodworkers to make sort of like mosaics on boxes and things with little pieces of wood. And they had special wood sourcers that went to secret places to get green oak and pink oak and other things. Again, there's no such thing as a green oak or pink oak. This was wood that these guys knew how to find by finding these little mushrooms, fruit bodies, and they knew that the wood was dyed permanently on the inside. So they would make these little chips of wood into these sceneries and things. There's also been religious icons in Eastern Europe as well, with all of these different kinds of permanently stained wood. This was before a lot of dyeing techniques came along. So pretty cool. But you don't have to look at logs and things to see spalting in action or go in the forest. You can see this right around your house, believe it or not. So if you have conifers around your house, there'll be needles on the ground, of course, and in those needles will be one of the most common fungi in North America, and you've never even heard of it, Lophodermium pinastri. This causes a needle cast. This fungus, no one really knows even what it does entirely. It just seems to live inside of the needles of the pine. I don't even know if it's really considered a pathogen. It's just living inside there doing its thing. When the needles fall off the tree, then it rots them and forms these little tiny fruit bodies, these like little pustules, and that's where the spores will come out, and the spores go all around, back up into the tree, and then the fungus starts its life cycle all over again. So why am I showing you this? Well, if you were to find these needles at your house, and I guarantee you have needles like this at your house, look at them really closely. You'll see these little pustules, but you'll also see in between these pustules little black lines. And that's a line that's been spalted and melanized by this fungus. There's a whole bunch of them. There's lots of them there. So this group here is probably one colony. This is one individual here, because here's a spalted line here and here. Over here, this is probably a different fungus, and they're probably not getting along, so they melanize this zone here to keep each other out. And then another line here, and another colony here, because there's a spalted line. Isn't that amazing? Hidden in plain sight, you probably have these at your home. If you're the type that likes to go on mushroom forays and looking for more species to add to your list, you need to know about microfungi like this, because, well, first of all, you'll be the only one at the foray that knows what they are, but then you can up your species list. So mentioned in the outset that the vast majority of fungi actually are not rotters. They're actually what we call biotrophs. So a lot of them are, another term for biotroph is a symbiont. A lot of people use this term symbiont to mean like a mutualistic organism where two things get along. That's not what it means. Symbionts are simply organisms that live in close association with each other for their whole lives. A pathogen that will kill its host, it's still a symbiont of its host by definition. So that's the way I use the term. But biotroph also kind of takes away any mystery. It literally means something that has to live with a living organism. It's not rotting dead stuff. So most fungi actually are biotrophs. A lot are parasites, many are pathogens, but many are mutualistic symbionts and partners with organisms and especially trees, as we'll see. But first, a couple interesting pathogens and predatory fungi. No organism is safe from fungi. All kingdoms are attacked by fungi. Bacteria are attacked by fungi, protozoans, animals, definitely plants. Most plant diseases by far are caused by fungi. Not that many attack us, thankfully. Most animal pathogens seem to be bacterial, but no group is safe, not even slime molds. This is a common slime mold here, seen in the Midwest, especially really hot weather like this, and we get a big thunderstorm probably end of the week. You will for sure see this in mulch, around flower beds, wherever. It may not be this color, but you'll see what looks kind of like vomit or dust or some sort of a weird patch of ashen gray amorphous mass. Maybe it'll be kind of peach colored or maybe even yellow colored. If you're lucky, you might see one that's a striking purple color. And this was until not terribly long ago, this was thought to be a strange variety of that regular dog vomit slime mold. It was the purple variety. The scientist actually was wrong. It's not a purple variety. It was a slime mold that had been attacked by this fungus called Nectriopsis violacea. Has anyone ever seen this before? Crystal's probably seen it. She's seen everything.
Not in real life.
If you have seen it, I know you've posted on Facebook because you post everything on Facebook, which is good. You know, it's really cool that with social media now, there's a lot of, just like plants, there's a lot of rare fungi that only fruit like once every 10 years or something. And it's so amazing because people will be posting photos. There's this one blue albatrellis as an example that fruits about every 10 years. And you'll see a wave of people posting photos and bragging about it all across North America and Europe. And then next year, nobody's posting it. So it's really cool for curiosity or even scientific purposes with people that like to brag about their photos. And I do too. Like a puffball, 17,000 feet. You know, I was bragging about that. So this is this cool fungus that attacks slime molds. That's all it does. It's all it's known to do. And it causes this really beautiful color. Here's a fungus that sort of is a parasite on other fungi. It's the genus Sporophagomyces. These scientific names might seem bewildering, but they actually make a lot of sense if you know about Latin and Greek. So this is a fungus, myces, that eats phago spores. So if you've seen polypores, these kind of conch things, these shelves on the sides of trees, sometimes they'll have a mold underneath. That could mean maybe it was last year's model or maybe even a couple years old and it's, you know, it's got a mold rotting it. But it might not mean that. It might mean it's a fresh specimen. It just has a Sporophagomyces growing underneath, right just above the pores. So as the spores of this Ganoderma are released, this guy grabs them all, and that's what it lives on, and nothing else. It seems like just spores produced by these big polypores. Has anyone ever seen one of these? This picture here is one found in Illinois. They're common around here. It's another one of those fungi. It's probably really common, and nobody ever sees it. And when you see it in discussions where like, oh, that's one of those things on my life list, I would like to see it. You've probably seen it at every foray, but you probably criticize some newbie for bringing in this moldy mushroom. Why would you do that? There's pretty specimens, but lo and behold, it might not be old. It may have this fungus on it. Isn't that really cool? You'd think that that's a weird thing to live off of, just the spores, but there's a lot of nutrition there. And I guess if you get enough spores, you can make a meal of it. I've never tried it. I've never had to. I can always find good mushrooms. So there's lots and lots of rust fungi. These are Basidiomycete fungi. So they're closely related to things like Ammonitas and Russulas and boletes, much more closely related to them than things like morels and gyrometras and things like that. They're Basidiomycetes. They look nothing like Basidiomycetes except for the spore-producing structure, and that's about it. Rusts attack all kinds of plants. Every kind of plant you know of gets rusts. Right now, you'll see rusts fruiting with these beautiful protuberances on your hawthorn trees or on your cedars around your house or on apple trees, etc. Quince, if you have quince. What's really cool about them is they have, for the most part, an alternate life cycle where to complete their life, an alternate host, whereby they have to go through two different, pretty distantly related host plants to complete their life cycle. So for example, like wheat stem rust also goes through barberries. So that's a grass and a broadleaf plant. White pine blister rust, also has like a grass host. So they're often really bizarre. And in a lot of cases, even though they might be commercially important and worth a lot of money to figure this out to stop this pathogen, in a lot of cases, it's still not even known what the alternate host is, which is kind of hard to believe, but true. A lot of rusts, though, do something else to get their spores around. It's a tiny little fungus that, for the most part, lives inside of a plant. It doesn't produce a great big platform for launching spores, a big mushroom. So they just have figured a different way. They just use the plant and basically cause the plant to produce a sort of a flower-looking structure that then attracts insect pollinators, and they take the spores away, just like those pollinators would normally take away pollen and take it to another plant. So they cause a thing known as pseudoflowers. So here's a plant that's infected with a rust, this Vaccinia rust. And this is the actual inflorescence of this little plant. I'm not sure what this is. It looks kind of like a marsh marigold or something, but this is the actual inflorescence. And here's these pseudoflowers here. So to you and me, that doesn't look that much like a flower, but to an insect, which, pollinator insects like bees and flies don't really use vision, frankly, at all. They use it for light and not light and up and down. And they use it for hand approaching before you get squashed. But as far as seeing things like this, that's not how they see. Insects see bright colors like UV light and things like that. They also go by smells because they have pretty sophisticated antennae. So for all intents and purposes, this probably smells and looks, glowing in UV very much like this. It maybe even looks more attractive, frankly. Okay, so the insect bumps into this, and then what happens? Well, it's not so simple as all that. These pustules here, that's where the fungal fruit bodies are, and the spores are produced. And they also exude a sweet nectar, much like the nectar that the flower produces. So the insect bumps into this, gets a reward, goes on to the next pseudoflower, or maybe even an actual flower, bumps into this, bumps into a flower over here, and guess what? It just inoculated this plant with the spores of this pathogen, and that's how the fungus gets around. Pretty amazing. We have lots and lots of species of Vaccinia that do these types of pseudoflower rusts. Many are being discovered all the time because nobody noticed them before, and they are so well camouflaged, and I guess nobody really thought to look for them. So pretty cool. So if you've never heard of those Vaccinia rusts that make pseudoflowers and lead to insects trying to pseudo-pollinate them, you probably have heard of this guy here. Cordyceps, or Ophiocordyceps is the new name for this, Cordyceps sinensis. This is a fungus that attacks a moth caterpillar in the high Himalayan areas, like around Tibet, even in Nepal somewhat, where we just were, although it's not the season to find them, but Tibet's the most famous place for these guys. This caterpillar, when it's infected with the fungus, and this is the fungal fruit body coming out of here. So this whole thing is collected. It's about as big as, not even as big as your pinky. It's not much bigger around than like a wooden match. They're quite small and skinny. Anyways, this is worth by weight far more than gold. And there's millions and millions of them out in these vast, very high elevation prairie areas. So people go looking for them. In fact, this has been a medicine used in Eastern medicine for centuries. So it's worth so much money, and everybody knows about it, to the extent that the vast majority of the gross national product of the Tibetan Autonomous Region is this. When it's in season to find these, all businesses, all schools, everybody stops what they're doing, and everyone goes into the mountains to collect them. So literally everybody, because it's worth so much money. And then the Chinese come over, the buyers, and buy these from people, and it's like the Wild West. Sometimes there's shootouts and things like that, because there's just millions of dollars coming and going from a place where people normally make like $10 a month as a salary. So this is really incredible, and it's believed to be useful in all sorts of different Eastern medicines for staving off diseases and curing things and whatnot. In any case, that really doesn't interest me all that much. It's kind of fascinating, but what interests me is the organism itself. So there's been a lot of discussion lately about, well, people are so good at collecting these things that is the fungus or the caterpillar are both going to go extinct if every single one's getting napped. So this is a real concern. There doesn't seem to be any diminishing of the collected numbers of these things year after year, but it's a real concern. A real concern until recently. Believe it or not, people have asked, as this gets more and more rare, and there's fewer and fewer of this infected caterpillar producing this mushroom stalk here, blowing spores, as this is more and more rare, what's the chances that these spores are now going to find a caterpillar? So eventually the whole system could collapse. Well, just a few years ago, it was discovered that it turns out the spores released by this thing probably aren't important at all in infecting the caterpillar. The caterpillars get infected because this ghost moth caterpillar, it feeds on all the grass that lives there. There's no trees, it's high elevation and it's too dry. There's no trees, it's just all kinds of grasses everywhere. The caterpillar gets infected by eating the grass. The fungus was already there in the grass everywhere. It's the most common fungus maybe in the world. Who knows? No one's really looked. It's something that we thought was going to go extinct turns out is super common. And so what really amazes me is that this fungus can get into this caterpillar, not kill the caterpillar. The caterpillar continues its entire life cycle just fine, reaches mature size, it sheds its skin, keeps growing, sheds another skin, keeps growing, does this like 4 or 5 times. Then it's the end of the season, the caterpillar is going to dig down a hole and pupate underground, just like it normally would if it was not infected. And then the next spring, instead of emerging as a moth, it's curtains. It's going to emerge as a fungal fruit body. But up until this point, everything's been all fine for the caterpillar. The fungus even controls the mind of the caterpillar to, after it's dug down into the ground, to orient itself so that its head is upright to more easily facilitate this fruit body coming out of its neck right here, which is where it always comes out. So it takes control of the mind of the caterpillar dies, and then it fruits. So what's more astounding to think that this fungus can live inside of this caterpillar and somehow produce hormones and things that tells the caterpillar what to do. The caterpillar's immune system doesn't kill it. But it also, before this even happened, it was living inside the plant its whole lifetime, and it's still there. And what's it doing there? Nobody knows. But somehow the plant doesn't kick it out. It's some sort of an endophyte that probably benefits the plant. So it's able to live in plants as well as an animal, which is just astounding. It's almost too good to believe. But I read it, so it must be true. So pretty cool. So wouldn't it be great if you could see stuff like this? Cordyceps, everyone wants to see cordyceps. Cordyceps species are super common. We have lots of them all around in Ohio right now, all around here, and you can see them. Here's one that's maybe the easiest to find. I say that because this is the one I see most often. This is a cordyceps that attacks other fungi. So it attacks the fungus Elaphomyces, the deer truffle. Here it is right here underground. And so this fungus has gone by the name Elaphocordyceps ophioglossoides. So it attacks. So the thing about the cordyceps, they attack all kinds of different arthropods. So insects like ants and caterpillars, also spiders and things like that. And they also attack cicadas, grasshoppers, crickets, and all of these are different groups of cordyceps. But there's also this group of cordyceps that also attacks other fungi, these truffles. So if you see something when you're crawling on your hands and knees right now out in the woods, looks like a matchstick sticking up, carefully excavate it because it could be attached to a bug or even to a truffle. Ironically enough, it's really dry times of the year, like right now, when I see cordyceps the most. It's probably because I've stopped even bothering trying to find mushrooms. There's not going to be mushrooms around. So usually you're crawling around stumps and things where there might be some moisture, and then you see these little things sticking up. So we saw lots of cordyceps in Nepal right along the path because we're walking along, the mountain comes down, so you're like eye level right with the soil. So I mean, they're actually really easy to see. Had you been walking in the forest around here, you probably wouldn't see them because you're 6 feet above the forest. So as bizarre as those are, that's not even the most bizarre fungi. So who's ever heard of this order of fungi called the Libulbiniales? Has anyone ever heard of Libulbiniales? Don't feel bad. Most mycologists have never heard of this group. This is the largest group of fungi species on Earth, and nobody's heard of this group of fungi. We don't even really know what they do, but we do know that they're the largest group. They have the largest number of species named. Labules, as they're called, because Labulbiniales is a lot to say. Labules seem to live on the exoskeletons of insects most often, and you'll see them, they're actually super common. I see them all the time. But you have to look really closely, they're super tiny. They're usually sort of on the back end of insects, and most people think that probably when males and females are getting together and, you know, when they love each other very much and they're going to have a baby, they copulate, and so one's rubbing around here, and probably that's how one labule infects from one individual insect to another and spreads around that way. They typically won't be covering the whole insect like this. There's usually be a patch here or maybe on the underside. But in any case, they seem to live only on the exoskeletons of insects. The mycelium only penetrates you know, just a few cells into the exoskeleton and maybe causes like no harm at all. It doesn't seem to be pathogenic to insects. When they're found, ironically enough, it's not usually in nature. Most of the time, new species are found in museums. One person is curating collections or doing research on all kinds of bugs that are in, you know, big boxes and looking, and they're like, oh, lo and behold, this species of centipede doesn't look like, or this individual, this species of centipede doesn't look like this one. And, oh, that's not another leg or another antennae. It's actual Labulbiniales, and, you know, people will share photos and someone will ID it for them. So unfortunately, that's about all I know about them, except for the fact that they're only just a few cells long. Mycelium goes down into the exoskeleton here. There's only like 3 or 4 or 5 cells long here. And other than that, we don't really know too much about what they're doing in nature. I'm not going to ask you if you've ever seen one before, because that would be ridiculous. Nobody ever sees them. They're so tiny. Here's something you for sure have seen, but you haven't seen all of it. This is the ash bolete. So it's been a few years since I was last, I'm from the Cincinnati area, and I graduated from Middletown Fenwick High School. But it's been a while since I've been to the area. So I don't know if ash trees have been wiped out yet. They're going, they have been wiped out? Okay. Okay, so anyways, they have only recently been wiped out. So you probably would remember seeing this mushroom in late summer, early fall under especially white ash trees. Super common. It's kind of a big kind of gross, muddy brown looking bolete. There'll usually be lots of them right in parks or on lawns, on green strips along the road. It's not one of those things you have to go in the woods to see. They're usually really common on lawns. Everyone's seen ash boletes, right? So the scientific name, Gyrodon Merlions. Well, like all boletes, it is a mutualistic mycorrhizal partner with the roots of ash trees. That's why you always see it with ash trees, except it's not. And not all boletes actually are mycorrhizal. This is something that's just been discovered in the last few years. So, but you have seen this under ash trees. So what's going on there? Well, if you dug down, I forget where I took this photo. I think this maybe was, actually, I don't know where it was. It was somewhere in the Midwest. It's a real common mushroom. If you dug down carefully, like with a spoon or something, and dug these things up, didn't just like pull them out of the soil, and you got a lot of the soil from the base of the stem, and we're really careful about moving the soil away, you'd find these like black peas at the base of the mushroom. What do you think's going on there? Well, these black peas are a gall from an insect that lives on the tiny root hairs of the white ash tree. And that's what the fungus is a partner of. Both have to have each other. The gall insect would get kicked out of the tree association by either the tree or some other bug would come along and eat it. If once it glommed onto the roots of the white ash tree, if it didn't get sort of encased by this fungus mycelium growing around it and forming this dark black gall around it, all of the nutrition coming from the tree down into the roots feeds the little insect, but a lot of the nutrition then goes from the insect into this fungus. And apparently that's the only thing this fungus lives on. Isn't that amazing? That's hard to believe. This was discovered also not all that long ago, maybe like, I think like 20 years ago or something. It's one of the most common mushrooms and trees until recently in the Midwest. And most people collecting it didn't even know what was going on. A lot of fungi, like boletes, are mutualistic symbionts with trees, and we call them mycorrhizal symbionts because the root or rhizae is the part of the tree where they're attached. So when you're out in the woods picking chanterelles or king boletes or ammonitas or russulas or lactarius or lacarias or courtnaries, or a lot of the groups of big showy mushrooms that we collect, either because they're interesting and pretty or because they're delicious culinary mushrooms, a lot of those cannot be cultivated. And the reason is because although you seemingly pick them from the soil, they're not growing from the soil. They're growing from the roots of the trees. And they're an obligate partner with the tree, meaning the tree cannot grow and live without that fungus, and the fungus cannot live without its tree partner. And here's what's going on. If you were to dig up little trees here, or tree roots of big trees out in the park or the forest, and look at the root tips, what you'd see is they're kind of fattened, but they also look moldy. These are little tiny seedlings of bristlecone pine. They were going to die anyway, so don't worry about them. They're little tiny bristlecone pine seedlings from, I think, New Mexico or Colorado. Anyways, if you look really closely at the roots, they look like they're moldy, like they're diseased or something, but they're not. This is the mycorrhizal partner. I don't know which fungus this is. A good guess might be Ammonite of Ascaria. It's a very common mycorrhizal association with bristlecone pine. I'm a big fan of bristlecone pine, so I often dig them up and try to grow them at my house, wherever we live. So we've moved around a lot, so there's bristlecone pines all over the place now. They don't seem to spread, so I don't think I'm causing any invasive problem. Anyways, so what's going on there? Well, the seedling, the seed germinates, the seedling starts growing and immediately gets sort of attacked, almost like by a parasitism of this obligate partner, like Ammonite of Ascaria in this case, and then it actually benefits the tree. If you were to grow these seedlings in some sort of a tank up against a glass plate, what you would see is the poor, pathetic little seedling has a tiny, puny little root system that stops right here. Same right here. This is just the root system of the tree. All this other stuff that looks like root, it's not root, it's all fungus. So when we say the trees live in sort of an obligate association, it really means that the fungus increases dramatically the surface area out in the soil, brings in water, brings in nutrition to the plant, and the plant really relies heavily on this. So this is another thing we learned in school when we were kids, that roots of trees function to, bring in water and nutrition to the tree, and the photosynthesis happens up on the top. And isn't this great? This isn't really what happens. The roots of trees basically is a stem that holds the tree down so it doesn't blow away when a strong wind comes. And you know this because if you've dug up tree roots, there's not much to them. They look like a naked stem. All the uptake from the environment of nutrition and water and all the goodies that the tree needs comes from this mycorrhizal partner here, the fungus. So what's going on? Well, it is sort of a parasitism, but both seem to benefit from this sort of association. The fungus, kind of penetrates a few cells thick into the root of the tree and passes on all sorts of nutrition. This shows potassium, magnesium, iron. There's also nitrogen and other things in water. And then the tree, after photosynthesis, sends carbohydrates over to the fungus. So both live in this obligate association. We know this because people and companies have tried to start tree farms in other parts of the world, and doesn't work because the wrong type of fungus is in the soil, and they don't have the right kind of fungus necessary to grow the trees. So, and this is really common. These mycorrhizal associations have evolved numerous times. And again, lots of fungi we are really excited about are mycorrhizal, like truffles and russulas and ammonitas, including the death cap there, and Ammonite of Ascaria there. Courtnarius, another huge group of Basidiomycete fungi, are mycorrhizal. Tricholomas, like the matsutake there. Lacarias, which are basically a weed all over the world, and maybe the most important mushroom as far as mycorrhizae go. Almost all the boletes, like that pretty lexinum there, chanterelles, and even some types of morels seem to be mycorrhizal. So this is the Midwest. So, I mean, I don't have to tell you, in the springtime, if you know what you're doing, you don't just go looking for morels anywhere. You probably look for certain types of trees, right? And what types of trees are those? Elm, right. Anything else? What about white ash?
Used to be ash.
Yeah. And even some other trees. If you're living in other parts of North America, there's a few other species you might go looking for. Also, you probably know about the very old apple tree phenomenon. So the real experts in the group are nodding. The people that are not quite in the know are like, no, I didn't know about this apple tree thing. Yeah, if you go to like forests where there used to be people in farms there and apple orchards, but now it's all overgrown and you see like the remains of an apple tree or maybe a few sort of apple tree stumps with a few sprigs in the middle of a forest, no apple tree is going to live there. Those were planted there like a century ago, and now the forest grew up around it. Go around that tree in the springtime and morel season. Then who's laughing? Well, not me, because you're picking my mushrooms, but you know what I mean. So the reason is because these have mycorrhizal associations with plants. With the morels, it's not entirely known still, but it seems to be a mycorrhizal association as well. So in fact, as it turns out, the vast majority of plants, probably every group of plants, except for the brassicas, like cabbages and stuff like that, but the vast majority of other plant groups seem to form these mycorrhizal associations with fungi, where they have to have the fungus on the roots. And as best as we can tell, all groups of trees do this all over the world. Isn't that pretty amazing? So it's just astounding how common these associations have happened. And yet, you know, a lot of people walking around trees in the park who have no idea that that tree is only there because it's being farmed by a fungus right under your feet. So the last section, and this will just take a couple seconds, is some notes about pathogens and scourges. So fungi and fungi-like organisms and other microbes have altered the course of the world many times. And the reason why different demographic groups live in different parts of the world very oftentimes has been because of fungi and fungi-like microbes. And Cincinnati is one good example. So first of all, what are these? Are you sure?
No.
So everything else I've shown you up to now has been a complete trick and why should this be different? No, these actually are potatoes. You're exactly right. They don't look like any potatoes you probably normally eat, but wild type potatoes, where potatoes come from, a lot of them look like this. So why am I telling you about potatoes? Well, where potatoes have gone around the world, there's been pathogens that go to wipe out the potatoes, just like all of our crop plants. And so in the case of potatoes, the most important economically by far of all the scourges of potatoes is Phytophthora infestant. Phytophthora means plant destroyer. It's this moldy looking pathogen that kills potato plants. And in fact, until a few decades ago, it was treated as a fungus and thought to be a fungus. It's actually not a fungus. It's a fungus-like organism. It's killed with fungicides and things like that. And mycologists still study it, but it's technically not a fungus, so we call it a fungus-like organism. Anyways, this is an amazing scourge of potatoes. So this field here was perfectly fine probably hours before this photo was taken. A single spore of Phytophthora infestans, late blight pathogen of potato, a single spore landing in this field in just a few days can kill the entire field. It's so astounding, and this is very, very real. This happens every year. So what happens is this spore germinates in the potato plant. It can be in the tuber underground. It can be in the leaf, in the stem, in the flower. It doesn't matter. And within hours, it's grown through parts of the potato plant and already come back out as spore-producing structures and now made thousands of spores. And so if the conditions are right, if it's very wet, the spores can germinate and swim all around the field through the wet, muddy soil, infect tubers and things, but they can also blow as well by the wind. So it only takes just a few days for an entire field to be wiped out. And the reason, this is the reason why potatoes are the most expensive, probably most expensive crop in North America to grow, believe it or not. Even though it's like the cheapest thing in the store to buy. So farmers spray their fields prophylactically all the time when conditions are almost right, because you can't wait till you see symptoms, it's already too late, the field's done for. So potato farmers basically lose money. You know, the more potatoes they grow, the more money they lose. So they're only in it because their family did it, and there's just no money growing potatoes. That's because of this one pathogen. Well, it's worse than that. So when potatoes were discovered and everybody started eating them about 2 centuries ago, it became a staple of people all around the world. They're fairly nutritious and they have a lot of carbohydrates, and you can grow mountains of them from, you know, one single seed. So it became a very important crop plant in Europe. And then the potato blight happened, and as we know, in the 1800s, that's when the potato blight hit Ireland and caused a lot of Irish people to starve to death and immigrate to North America. In fact, the population of Ireland to this day is still less than it was in the mid-1800s, because this was such a big problem, killed so many people. I think over 1 million people died, and like another 1 million or 2 million left. And it was a very big problem, and put an Irish cop on every street corner in Boston, as they say. But it wasn't just Ireland. Throughout Europe, similar things happened, but maybe not on such a big scale. Even happened in Germany. So, and in fact, Germany in the mid-1800s had a double whammy. The murrain, the potato murrain, as they called the disease, came through and wiped out a very common food item. But there are also a number of revolutions going on in the mid-1800s at the same time in several states in Germany. So that led, both of those factors combined, led to lots and lots of people immigrating and moving to the New World, and a lot of them settled in Cincinnati. So that's why Cincinnati has big brewing tradition, big sausage making tradition. There's places that seemingly have German sounding names, like Over the Rhine district, etc. It's because of the mid-1800s. That's when a huge wave of German immigrants came to North America. So we still haven't mentioned about the deal with the potatoes. So where do potatoes come from, and why wasn't this disease a problem until the 1800s? So where do potatoes come from? Yes, the Andes in South America. In the Andes in South America, the place of origin of potatoes never had this disease. And this was only discovered in, I think, the 90s. So potatoes come from here. Phytophthora infestans, the late blight pathogen, attacks in nature, normally, other types of solanaceous plants, nightshades and tomatoes, stuff like that. And this is where Phytophthora infestans normally was from. So potatoes had never seen and had no resistance to this fungus. Potatoes were taken back to the old world. Europeans loved potatoes, couldn't eat enough potatoes, and then everywhere the Europeans went, they took potatoes with them. So when the Europeans came to the New World, they of course brought potatoes and other important things with them, livestock they were going to need, and tobacco or whatever they wanted to grow, or lumber, I don't know, whatever they used. And that's when potatoes first got hooked up with Phytophthora infestans. Then when trade goes back and forth between the New World and the Old World, potatoes, sweet potatoes, etc., that's how then Europe got inoculated with Phytophthora infestans, the late blight pathogen. But something really interesting happened during all of this. By a weird coincidence, there was only one mating type of the fungus made it to Europe, and it stayed like that for about a century. Only this one mating type. So there was no sexual reproduction. The fungus only reproduced asexually. That's what this chart shows here. Potato plants get infected, they asexually produce spores. Lots of fungi do this. Maybe all fungi reproduce asexually as well as sexually. And this went on forever. Well, what this meant was there was no genetic diversity in the fungus. So it was pretty easy to develop potatoes that were resistant, and pesticides that the fungus was not resistant to. It stayed like that for about a century, and it seemingly the disease was quelled. Then in the 1990s, a second mating type made its way to Europe and back to North America. And so now to this day, potatoes are getting wiped out again, and there may not be any cure. You know, there's more genetic diversity, and now breeding of resistant potatoes doesn't seem to work anymore. So the upshot is, like bananas and some of our other crops, they actually really still could go by the wayside. Do you like eating sweet potato fries or taro chips? Because you very well still may have to if potatoes go extinct, which actually could happen. There's been other crops that have been completely wiped out. In the 70s, the entire wheat crop of North America failed for 2 years in a row. Who remembers this? Nobody. If that happened right now, there would be mass starvation in the world. There would be wars because of it. We would have enough wheat here and enough bread because we have a rich country and we grow wheat, but lots of places would not have enough food. If the wheat crop in North America failed, like 25% of the world's carbohydrates would no longer be around. That would be mass calamity. So stuff like this really still can happen. And as we've seen with other types of pandemics, you know, we haven't figured out how to fix everything. So I think with that, that's probably, yes, that's my 1 hour mark. So I'll stop right there. It's a good place to stop with Germans coming to Cincinnati. And